making this film, we were asking the pilots to describe their impressions when they first met the Su-27 fighter. Each and all pointed at excellent maneuvering characteristics of the aircraft and its combat capabilities. Many favorable comments were made on the outward beauty of the aircraft, and even the impressive dimensions of the fighter excited certain emotions. Almost every pilot, when recalling his first flight on the Su-27, was quoting as an example the words of the test pilot Vladimir Ilyushin. Vladimir Ilyushin once said that he flew the aircraft which was smarter than him. These are very true words. I recall his words when I flew this aircraft myself. The feeling was exactly the same. It felt like the aircraft flew itself, and the pilot didn't have to make any actions. Due to the fly-by-wire system implementation, this aircraft became very smart, as many pilots like to say. Test pilot Vladimir Ilyushin, who was the first to fly this aircraft, used to say that the Su-27 was smarter than a pilot. I definitely agree with Ilyushin. When I started to fly this aircraft, I felt the same way. When a pilot flies a new aircraft, he tries to feel it, tries to become a part of it. If you're able to feel your aircraft, then you can analyze your actions and the aircraft capabilities, which is very important. Only when you've got this feeling of being a part of your aircraft, you can use the aircraft capabilities to maximum. The aircraft capabilities are almost unlimited. To say it has a short turning or maneuvering radius is to say nothing. To fly this aircraft is a wonderful feeling. I would say that the Su-27 is the best aircraft I have ever flown. The Su-27 didn't become the best fighter right away. There were many years of tense work, and there were some tragedies as well. But now the flanker's flight is accompanied with such epithets as unsurpassed maneuverability, grace, beauty, and power. And if you want to experience all the power and capabilities of the fighter, don't waste your time. Enter a flight school and choose one of the best professions in the world, the profession of a military pilot. Aerobatic flying. In the Russian language, this phrase also means high skill, great mastership in one thing or another. But for a fighter, aerobatic flying is an ordinary job. This aircraft is performing the Cobra. This very maneuver became the trademark of the Su-27. It's hard to describe my feelings. I'm sure that every pilot would like to perform this maneuver, or at least to sit next to the pilot who makes it. I don't think it's worth becoming just for the sake of performing this maneuver, but someone might have little dreams. To put a pressurized suit and a crash helmet on, oxygen mask, to try a control stick, or try to perform a maneuver, even maybe Pugachev's Cobra. I'm sure your desire to become a pilot compromises such little dreams. Different books and films play a tremendous role in my choice to become a military pilot. When I was young, I used to read a lot of adventure books. One of my favorite was Two Captains. I like films on the World War II, where the main characters are military pilots. I'm also fond of a model airplane flying. Like in every profession, it's important to be on the edge. The profession of a pilot comes first in aviation, and I always wanted to be not just a pilot, but a fighter pilot. I'm married, I have 2 children. My son is 12 and my daughter is 1.5 years old. She knows I'm a pilot. Her first word was Dad. When she sees an aircraft, she points at it and shouts, "My dad, my dad." My family, my wife, and the children like my profession very much. Especially my son is very proud of me. He is proud that his father flies the best aircraft in the world. Even my mother-in-law is proud that her son-in-law flies the best fighter. Everybody are proud. The Su-27 pilots using aviation slang are simulating the oncoming flight.
91, атакую. Вилку вправо. Начали. Огонь. 091, атакую.
The Su-27 cockpit is spacious enough for a pilot of any size. Though there are quite a few devices and switches in the cockpit, their layout is standard for any fighter. This is flight navigation data, engine monitoring instruments, and fuel gauge. The Ekran system, which displays some data control and emergency signals. This is the control stick, with many buttons, including automatic system control button and armament control button.
Вижу двоих на месте. Атакую. Винт вправо. Начали.
This red button turns the automatic control system off. This is a trim button. This is a horizontal alignment button. This button provides aiming during aerial combat. This is a missile launch trigger. Here is the weapon selector for close aerial combat and long-range combat.
Наблюдаю двоих. Огонь. Атакую. Крышу вправо. Вижу двоих. На месте.
This device shows me which type of weapon threatens my aircraft and from which side.
Разворот вправо на 180. Узел влево. Начали. Вижу двоих. Пуск.
On the left, there are engine throttles. There are 2 throttles, left engine and right engine. They are in idle position now. My pilot controls these engine throttles. This is a thrust rating position. To switch to afterburning mode, I lift the knob and move the throttle. The same when I want to switch the afterburners off.
Краб влево начали.
There are 2 engines installed on the Su-27 aircraft. This is very important in terms of redundancy. For example, the MiG-23 or MiG-21 are single-engine aircraft. Sometimes, in emergency situations, the pilot has to shut the engine off. The best outcome in this situation is the pilot's ejection and the loss of the aircraft. 4th-generation aircraft, such as the Su-27, for example, are equipped with 2 engines, which is very good. The Su-27 has an adaptive wing. These deflective surfaces do not have fixed deflection. The wing gets adapted to ram. Depending on the speed, altitude, or angles of attack, the wing takes the most advantageous aerodynamic shape for current flight mode. Due to this feature, the Su-27 aerodynamic characteristics are improving.
очень в лучшую сторону, аэродинамические качества существенно улучшаются.
I would say the wing is breathing as if it were alive. This is one of the Su-27 features no previous aircraft had before. The Su-27 aircraft is equipped with a radar sight during aerial combat or target interception. This radar sight plays an important role. It can detect multiple targets from long distances. It also tracks visual targets in close air combat. The radar sight can lock multiple targets. Radar is the core of the radar sighting system. The radar allows detecting fighter-type air targets at a distance of up to 100 kilometers. A target can be detected with the optical detection station. This peculiar eye is installed directly in front of the cockpit canopy. This system comprises an infrared search and tracking system and a laser rangefinder and target designator. Tracking range of the optical detection system is less than that of a radar. But there's one advantage. The optical detection system can detect a target without exposing it to radiation and therefore to perform a covert attack. Due to the helmet-mounted display in close air combat, all the data can be fed to the missile's homers. All these three components, the radar, the optical detection station, and the helmet-mounted display, are parts of a single weapon control system. Head-up display, which is installed in the Su-27 cockpit, is a very useful device. On this display, a pilot receives all the necessary information. It can be flight navigation and target data. It also gives him information on the radar functioning mode. This is a very easy-to-use head-up display, which does not distract pilots during close air combat or target interception. When firing the cannon, two curves on the indicator represent the impact zone. Depending on the aircraft maneuver, these curves change their curvature.
Наблюдаю одного. Подтягиваю нисходящее. 92, выход вправо. 091, пара, работу закончили.
Выпусти шасси.
When pilots begin flying the flanker, they usually start with combat trainer version of the aircraft, which is called the Su-27UB. It's common practice. Almost every single-seat fighter has its two-seat trainer version. But it's worth saying that all the previous two-seat trainers were inferior to single-seat aircraft in combat performance. In order to arrange a space for the second crew member, it was required to remove either the radar or some armament. Plus, a view from the second cockpit was far from being perfect. The Su-27 combat trainer version proved that the flanker has a great potential for further upgrades. Combat capabilities of the Su-27UB are the same as of the single-seat version. More than that, for long-distance flight, it's more preferable to use the two-seat version. In this case, the crew workload is significantly reduced. My longest flight lasted for 15 hours and 42 minutes. I spent nearly 17 hours in the aircraft cockpit. It was quite difficult to sit in the cockpit for such a long time. During the flight from Moscow to Komsomolsk-on-Amur and back, we performed 4 air refuelings from IL-78 air tanker. 2 on the way to Komsomolsk and 2 on the way to Moscow. The transfer flight, which is described in the interview, was performed exactly on the Su-27UB. Igor Votintsev was the second crew member and Nikolai Sadovnikov was the aircraft commander. The flight was made on June 23, 1987. Little before that, this crew flew to Graham Bell Airfield. This is the most remote airfield in the north of Russia based on Franz Joseph Land archipelago. During these transfer flights, the air refueling system was tested. Shortly after the tests, the system was used on the aircraft new versions. It's easy to notice that some Su-27 versions have little additional wings in front of the main wing. These little wings are called canards. Canards allow to improve stability and controllability of the aircraft. But as it often happens in aerodynamics, some negative effects come alongside with advantages. In case of the canards, there is a drag increase which results in the maximum speed reduction. So don't expect to find canards on every aircraft. Canards are used on certain aircraft where they are really necessary. For example, in the early 80s, they decided to upgrade Flanker with a new radar set. It was an advanced radar, but heavier than the previous one. Therefore, configuration with canards was chosen for a new aircraft. The aircraft nose part weight was increased, which required strengthening of the nose landing gear leg. 2 wheels instead of 1 were installed. With a new radar, the fighter could efficiently detect ground and sea surface targets. Apart from air-to-air missiles, the air-to-surface missiles became part of the aircraft armament. The Su-27M was the designation of the new multi-purpose aircraft version. But this version was developed when the country was going through hard times. In the early 90s, most of the aircraft projects were closed. The Su-27M wasn't put into service. But the carrier-based version of the aircraft was far more lucky. In the Soviet Union, the history of carrier-based aircraft began in the 70s. In the middle 80s, the Soviet Navy had 4 aircraft carrying cruisers. They were a base for Yak-38 carrier-based vertical takeoff and landing attack aircraft. The NATO aircraft carrying fleet was a different story. There were more than a dozen aircraft carriers, carrier-based aircraft of different types and purposes. That was indeed an efficient tool of world politics. Therefore, the Soviets decided to build new aircraft carriers and new carrier-based aircraft. Among these aircraft were the Yak-44 radar picket airplane, Yak-141 supersonic vertical takeoff and landing aircraft, MiG-29 and Su-27 carrier-based versions. Each of these aircraft had a different destiny. The Yak-44 wasn't even built, and Yak-141 became no more than a prototype airplane. As for the MiG-29 and the Su-27, there was a real rivalry between them to become a carrier-based aircraft. Eventually, only one aircraft was chosen for an aircraft carrier. That was the Su-27K, where K stood for carrier-based. Later on, this fighter became known as the Su-33. The Su-33 project was started even before the Su-27 mass production began. We had a small group of designers who worked on carrier-based aircraft. But the real full-scale work on this project began in 1983-1984. We had a goal to develop such a system which could break up enemy raids and to provide air defense of the ship main attack force. This main attack force would include an aircraft carrier. We had a lot of meetings in which Soviet Fleet Admiral Gorshkov took part. This main force was expected to consist of several aircraft carriers. It could have been a large-scale program, but with disintegration of the Soviet Union, our finances were cut short. Anyway, we built approximately 30 production aircraft under this project. These aircraft are still in service nowadays. Let's have a closer look at the Su-33 to define some features of carrier-based aircraft. It's obvious that the carrier-based aircraft have to be relatively compact. That is why most of the aircraft of such type have a folding wing. It's a challenging engineering task to design and manufacture such a wing. First, it's required to provide the sufficient structural strength. Second, there are fuel tanks in the wing, so their total capacity has to be retained to a maximum. The designers also have to take into account the control system and missile suspension points. Takeoff is another problem to solve. It's obvious that a deck length is much shorter than the length of a ground runway. Takeoff run on the aircraft carrier is 100 meters only. More than that, the Su-27 carrier-based version is heavier than the original aircraft, and this extra weight somehow affects the carrier-based aircraft flight performance. So the Su-33 wing was designed in such a way that it created higher lift as compared to that of the Su-27. This was achieved due to the improved wing high lift devices with the flaps installed in addition to flaperons. To increase flight distance, the Su-33 was equipped with an air refueling system where, with the help of the system, the aircraft could be refueled either from a special tanker aircraft or the same Su-33. The most crucial task for a Navy pilot is a carrier deck landing. For a safe deck landing, the aircraft landing speed must be as low as possible. But at low speeds, it's much harder to control an aircraft. This is when the powerful high-lifting devices of the Su-33 wing become useful. Due to these devices, the Su-33 is stable and has good controllability at low speed. In general, the approach path of the aircraft carrier deck differs from the traditional one. When the aircraft approaches a ground-based airfield, its descending path has the so-called flare-out portion. This is where the approaching aircraft reduces its descending vertical speed to make a softer landing. For landing on the aircraft carrier, there's no flare-out portion, so the landing becomes more accurate. Accuracy in this case has a critical importance. As a result, an aircraft lands on the deck at higher vertical speed. In order to stop a fighter at the short deck, there's an arresting hook installed on the aircraft. This hook picks an arresting gear cable. However, there's a big load on the aircraft structure. Ensuring the fighter's structural strength caused an increase of the aircraft weight. Speaking of all these technical details, let's not forget about the man in the cockpit. When the carrier-based aircraft lands on the deck, the pilot experiences a high G-load. At the same time, he has to keep the situation under control. And in case of some emergencies, like arresting gear failure, the pilot must have enough time to take his aircraft back into the sky. All over the world, pilots of the carrier-based aircraft are considered elite. I will tell you one thing, every deck landing is like your first landing. There is a place for fear in our profession. One might call it fear, the other might not. It's an instinct of self-preservation, which is normal. A pilot must have this instinct. If a pilot doesn't have it, it's not good for him. This instinct helps you to be self-disciplined, attentive, and to make a correct judgment. Every Navy pilot, be it a novice or experienced pilot, is told that even if the arresting hook is on, you must not lose your concentration. When there's time for the hook to pick up a cable, you have to be ready to eject any second. When the hooks pick up an arresting cable, it's sort of an unexpected pleasure. This is really an unexpected pleasure. The load, the braking, you feel it with all your body. It's like an extreme. Your head, hands, and legs experience a huge load. For a Navy pilot, it is definitely a pleasure. Deck landing requirements are very strict. The deck landing is the most difficult type of landing. Let's say the maximum deviation from the deck center line is about 4 or 5 meters, but we try to stay within 3 meters. To imagine emotional stress during deck landing, you have to see it with your own eyes. Imagine the aircraft parked at afterdeck. If the approaching fighter is within the limits of maximum deviation, the distance from its wing to the nose of parked aircraft is 3 meters only. There is a pilot in the cockpit of the parked aircraft. There are technicians under the plane. At this moment, the approaching aircraft lands. It touches the deck at the speed of 240 kilometers per hour. Can you imagine this noise, this roar when the engines are in maximum thrust? Then the hook picks up the arresting cable. The Navy operates in the Arctic or the Atlantic Ocean under conditions of strong wind, cold weather, hard rocking. Only brave men can work in such difficult conditions. Their work is very hard, but they are all very qualified personnel. I would compare it to an ant colony, where everybody knows what to do. These people deserve a lot of respect. The history of the Russian carrier-based fighter aircraft is not long. However, there is a Navy pilot school in the country. To a large extent, this is an achievement of Timur Apakidze. He was one of the first pilots who flew the Su-33 and then became a commander. He was teaching other pilots to fly this carrier-based aircraft. Yes, we have such a concept. And we know that Timur Abakidze was the founder of our National Navy Pilot School. In fact, he taught us how to fight, both on the ground and in the air. He founded this new type of fighter pilot school even before the Soviet aircraft carrier went into service. The fourth-generation fighters required a new approach. The aerial combat tactics was changed completely. Therefore, the principles of the combat training had to be changed also. The new combat training was developed, and new maneuvers appeared, and we began to study new tactics. Before starting service on the aircraft carrier, the pilots are trained at the Special Ground Complex. At one time, the Su-33 was tested here as well. For that purpose, initially, they used the original Su-27 land-based aircraft. This aircraft is taking off from the ramp. And this is its predecessor. This aircraft is called the T-10-3. It's the third copy of the initial aircraft configuration. This is a unique aircraft in its own way. It was made not in Moscow, but at the Komsomolsk-on-Amur aircraft plant. It is this plant that became the main aircraft plant for production of the Su-27 aircraft family. There was a lot of work to do. To provide smooth braking after deck landing, a lot of tests were conducted. These included aircraft structural strength and arresting equipment load. In 1983, for the first time in the history of our aviation, test pilot Fastovets on the MiG-29 and test pilot Sadovnikov on the Su-27 took off from the ramp. These takeoffs proved that takeoff from the ramp is possible and the aircraft behaves steady. When we started to perform the first ram tests, it was always surprising for me how the 30-ton aircraft took off from the ramp, climbing smoothly without losing altitude. More than that, we had to change a Navy pilot manual. In this manual, we had to write down that after takeoff, a pilot must wait 4 seconds. 4 seconds later, the pilot gained the speed. The aircraft is controlled on. It's possible to begin combat mission. The first deck landing was performed by Viktor Pugachev. It was on November 1st, 1989. What camera is this? Is it a Sony? Make one copy for me, please. Next day, November 2nd, the Su-33 made its first deck takeoff. But this takeoff created quite a big problem. When Pugachev turned the afterburners on, the blast fence couldn't hold their power. The fence was partly destroyed by the pressure of the fighter jet blast. The aircraft had to be moved to another position for the takeoff. The frontline bomber Su-34 stands aside from all the numerous Su-27 fighter versions. However, for a person who is not well familiar with different airplanes of the Su-34 relation to the family of the Su-27 aircraft is not obvious. Especially that each of these two aircraft has a different purpose. They are also externally different indeed. The idea to develop a new combat aircraft for destroying ground targets emerged in the early 80s. By that time, the Su-17 and the MiG-27 fighter bombers, as well as the Su-24 frontline bombers, were operational in the Soviet air regiments. The main task for an aircraft of such type is bombing and missile air attack at enemy ground targets. For the flight mission, these aircraft usually fly under the cover of fighters because their own capabilities to resist an air attack are limited. But what if one could develop a frontline bomber capable to conduct an aerial combat solo with enemy fighters? For a long period of time, to design such an aircraft wasn't possible. Otherwise, they had to give some aircraft characteristics up in favor of its combat load. This was unacceptable for a frontline bomber. Only with the Su-27 these contradictions were solved. This aircraft met all the requirements. Decent flight range, impressive combat load, excellent maneuvering characteristics. Given the frontline bomber specifics, it was necessary to modify the fighter. Initially, the Su-34 was called the Su-27EB, where in Russian the last two letters stand for fighter bomber. The future aircraft prototype first flight was made on April 13, 1990. The aircraft was piloted by test pilot Anatoly Ivanov. The most extensive structural changes were made to a front part of the aircraft fuselage. Two crew members sit next to each other. To be more precise, they sit side by side. Such arrangement of the seats makes it easier for a pilot and his navigator to communicate with each other during long flights. Total time of the Su-34 flight mission with air refueling can be more than 10 hours. It's important to feel the shoulder of your crewmate during such flight. When they need a rest or something to eat, crew members can take turns. The cockpit height allows the pilots to stand up during the flight. There's enough space to stretch, to squat in the Su-34 cockpit. It's very important for the aircraft crew during long-distance flights to have extra space in the cockpit. Crew members enter their cockpit in quite an original way. To enter the Su-27 cockpit, the canopy is lifted, while in the Su-34, a pilot must climb through the well of the front leg wheel. On March 28, 2009, the president of the Russian Federation, Dmitry Medvedev, made a familiarization flight on the Su-34 aircraft, piloted by Colonel Yuri Gritsayenko. He described the capabilities of the aircraft to the president. The maximum takeoff weight of this aircraft is 45 tons. 45. This Su-34 is sort of a mixture of different aircraft types. It can be used as a fighter because it was built on the basis of the Su-27. It can also be used as a frontline bomber like the Su-24. Its combat potential is similar to a bomber and also has a similar bomb load like the Tu-22 bomber. The Su can perform long-range flights because this aircraft is equipped with an air refueling system. What are the distances? Without air refueling, the flight range is 4,250 kilometers. With one air refueling, it's 7,000 kilometers. Every air refueling increases the aircraft flight range. This aircraft can fly non-stop from Moscow to Vladivostok and back.
Su-46 на взлетную.
Su-46 разрешил на взлетную?
Понял.
It's also worth mentioning that the total Su-34 bomb load is 8 tons, which is not bad at all for a frontline bomber. Strike aircraft combat missions are very specific. The long flights are often performed at low and extreme low altitudes. It's safer to pass through the enemy air defense system that way, and it also makes the strikes more effective. But portable air defense missile systems and even small arms are a big danger for the aircraft at such low altitudes. Therefore, the Su-34 cockpit is a titanium armored capsule. Other vital parts of the aircraft are also armored, which means this aircraft can also be classified as a ground attack airplane, such as the Su-25, for example. At the same time, the Su-34 frontline bomber is able to stand for itself in aerial combat. This aircraft is very maneuverable, and its maneuvering characteristics are inherited from the flanker. The frontline bomber is equipped with up-to-date air-to-air missiles. The Su-34 maneuvering characteristics are close to those of the Su-27. For a pilot, the Su-34 is like a fighter. This aircraft is very maneuverable and very easy to control. In the end, all the work on the aircraft modification increased its weight. As it was said before, the Su-34 maximum takeoff weight can achieve up to 45 tons. Therefore, the aircraft airframe had to be strengthened, and the new landing gear with rear leg two-wheel bogie was designed. At landing, first the rear wheel touches the runway, then the front one. The Su-34 landing is very smooth. I can't think of any pilot who had a rough landing on the Su-34. This aircraft is like a cruiser. The aircraft became operational in the Russian Air Force in 2006. These aircraft are manufactured in the Novosibirsk aircraft plant. The Su-34 is the aircraft of the near future. In 1999, another Sukhoi family fighter modification was developed. The crew seats arrangement is similar to the Su-34 aircraft. There is an arresting gear in the rear part, which means this aircraft is carrier-based. This is the Su-27 KUB, and its carrier-based combat trainer. With its capabilities, this is an aircraft of a new era. However, by the time we were producing our film, this aircraft existed in one copy. Only time will tell the Su-27 KUB future. But it's not the matter of the aircraft future alone. The Su-27 KUB is another evidence that the Su-27 aircraft has a unique development and upgrading potential. All the more, as the new century was approaching, the Sukhoi fighter family continued its development, and its new versions were about to make their appearance.